Who was the weakest link in the band Metallica? Let's talk about it. So of course, in any good band and in any great band, there's often not a weakest link. The point of this game is to choose a weakest link in a band even when there isn't one. Okay, so starting off with Metallica, you can actually make a case for any one of the four members being the weak link in the band, even though this doesn't seem to be the case at first glance. At first glance, you would be tempted to say, well, you can't replace James because he writes most of the riffs and he writes most of the lyrics, and he is the lead singer, he is the foundational guitar player, and he is the leader of the band. But at the same time, if you go back deep into Metallica's history on Kill 'Em All and on the No Life Till Leather demos, a lot of the material on their early stuff is Dave Mustaine driven. And in that sense, there's still a strong Metallica sound to the band, even before Hetfield began to be the primary riffmeister. As far as the vocals go, I don't think there's anybody out there that would suggest that James Hetfield is a great vocalist. He's an adequate vocalist, but he's not a great vocalist. It would have totally been possible to find somebody else to do the vocals for Metallica without greatly disturbing the band. Now, the lyrics is another topic altogether, and we'll save that aside for the moment. Now let's move on to the second fundamental pillar of the band in most people's idea is Lars. And in this respect, it's largely due to his ability for arrangements and for having a conceptual vision of how a song works together and how all of its parts function. So he's a very valuable asset in the studio. As far as his drumming goes, that is a topic for its own video, but loosely speaking, Lars takes a lot of criticism for his drumming, but he also has a ton of fans for his drumming. One thing that has to be factored in when you're thinking about Lars as a drummer is context of his playing. He's in a band that the bottom end, where the drums are supposed to occupy space, is largely taken up by the chugging E string on the guitars, and then you've got a bass. So unlike a lot of bands where there's space for the drums to really cover that bottom end, Lars is in a band where he's competing with the rest of the members to go into what's normally the natural range of the drummer. At the same time, he's always playing at super fast tempos, and that minimalizes the amount of creativity that a drummer can have, because you can't cram that much into a short space without it just sounding like a typewriter going diggy, 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 diggy. And he's limited by the role that he has to play in the band, and within that context you have to judge his drumming. You can't just say, well, Lars sucks because he's always playing the same beat, or Lars isn't that great of a drummer because he doesn't really stand out, for the reasons that I just gave. Alright, so let's move on to Kirk. Kirk is one of those guitar players that people like to look down on. They say, well, he's not the greatest guitarist in the world, but he tries really hard, or he isn't as good as this guitarist or that guitarist, particularly in terms of shredding, but he gets the job done. Well, this is exactly what his role is in the band. If he overstepped that role, he would just be doing nothing but causing friction and trouble. So if you had someone in the band like Yngwie or Paul Gilbert or Steve Vai or anybody that you care to name, they would tend to overplay and step over a lot of what is essentially a garage sound that James and Lars have worked very hard to preserve over the years. So I think that the fact that Kirk doesn't overplay is an asset, not a bad thing. The problem with his playing is that he generally has the same guitar tone all the time. It's largely wah-wah pedal driven. He tends to play the same kinds of solos again and again and again, and although he does have an emotional power to what he does, there are times when his emotional delivery is a bit subpar as well, in my opinion. All right, this moves us on to the final member. It's Cliff Burton, because in this video we're only dealing with the original Metallica up through Master of Puppets. So when it comes to Cliff Burton, you have to factor in that he was a very charismatic bass player in terms of, you got a lot of spotlight on him in a very short period of time. Not just because he was doing bass solo, and not just because of, he had kind of a cool look to him with his denim thing going on there, but he actually found a way to make the bass stand out in the fray of Metallica without much of an effort at all. And if you go back to Sabbath, which is the beginning point for all true metal bands, and no band more so than Metallica, you'll see that Geezer Butler kind of snakes his way through the mix, through the fury of Iommi's riffs and the thunder of Bill Ward. He kind of gallops through there, and he has what Iommi called a loud but shy style, and that's a great way of putting it when it comes to Geezer Butler. So I would say that Cliff Burton wanted to find a way to make his bass stand out that was completely different than Geezer Butler, and he found what I would call a sharp style of playing bass. In other words, it's like a razor cutting through the mix, and rather than just staying down at occupying the low end, it was trebling up into the mid-range, kind of equivalent to Noel Redding in the Jimi Hendrix Experience. And in this case, I think it worked really well because he wasn't accompanying that sharp playing with like vicious technique. He had very studied technique. So he had a very polished technique, but he had a really vicious attack. And I think that was a great combination for a bass player, and I think he had a wonderful imagination and musicality to him. So as bass players go, I think Cliff Burton deserves every bit of the recognition that he has had. Okay, so let's go back and kind of regroup. We've looked at all four members, and we've seen some of their strengths and some of their weaknesses. And going back to Hetfield, I would say, okay, while you could find a better singer and you could technically find somebody to step in and play the guitar, you're gonna have a hard time finding anybody that brings the total package like James. He's the band leader. He is the person who constructs the foundational element of the riffs, and he is the frontman. So I don't think he is the weakest link. I think that he is probably the strongest musician in the band, all said. When it comes to Kirk, I think that you can make a very strong case that he's replaceable. I think that you could have put another guitarist in there that played in virtually any style, and they could occupy the same space as Hammett without greatly disturbing the band. The only problem that I can see is finding a guitarist who would be willing to play all of Hetfield's songs and contribute minimally to the creative process, step in and play a solo that's pretty limited in its scope. So Hammett has a team player mentality that gives him a boost. When it comes to Lars, I think that his ability to work with James, even though they have had interpersonal problems throughout the tenure of the band, is an irreplaceable element. It's an X factor. It's the reason that the band is so cohesive. So if you go back and look at one of my earlier videos, like the earliest videos I made, it was about, is Metallica actually just a two-man band, a garage type band with Lars and James as the heart of it. And so I don't think you can get rid of Lars. And as I just said with Cliff, although cruel fate made it the case that we did have to see what happened to the band after they lost Cliff, I don't think they ever actually got any better for having lost him. I don't think that Jason Newsted was a better bass player. I don't think that he ever found a better role within the band than Cliff. Cliff was the bass player for the band, and he was a star in his own right. So I don't think that he was the weakest link. That leaves me with the, somewhat sad conclusion, but somewhat obvious conclusion that it's Kirk Hammett that could have been the most easily replaced without doing severe damage to the band. And while I like Kirk, I think he's a really good guitar player, I think that you could have got virtually any 80s, late 80s, mid 80s level metal guitarist in there, as long as they were willing to do it, and they could have played adequately. And had they played with less imagination and less enthusiasm than Kirk, it still wouldn't have brought the band down all that much, because the lead guitar isn't that important in Metallica. This is what I think, and what's really important is what you think. So go ahead and leave a comment in the section below, and remember to like and subscribe. Thanks a lot.